This is just a totally different US-India relationship today. And my great regret is that the Trump administration, through its first 300 days, did significant damage to that strategic relationship. It was only when the price cap came in place that India became such a major buyer of Russian energy. India did so at the time with the strong support of the Biden administration. There has been a loss of trust in some parts of the Indian strategic community because of how these issues have been handled. Indian policymakers can say, okay, let's meet the Trump administration in their own terms on the issues that are important to them. India will be a beneficiary from America's energy abundance. It will create beneficial impacts for India. You cannot have a China plus one strategy if you're a major American manufacturing company unless you have a presence in India.
Hello and welcome back to the Hindustan Times podcast. I am your host, Shashank Matu. Over the last couple of weeks, the conversation really between India and the United States has been on the front of energy. We've seen major new sanctions being unveiled against companies like Rosneft and Lukoil, both major Russian companies that India purchases a lot of energy from. At the same time, we've seen Indian state-owned refiners say that they're going to draw down much of their energy relationship with Russia. We're also seeing major energy contracts that have been signed with the United States, with the Union Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Puri, announcing a major new contract between India and the United States for the supply of liquefied petroleum gas. So a very interesting set of developments taking place with the United States pushing its own energy exports towards India, also ensuring that India purchases less from Russia. What does that mean for India's energy mix more broadly? What does that mean for the geopolitics of that triangle between India, the United States, and Russia? Joining me to unpack this is someone who has dealt with these issues extremely closely over the last couple of years, Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, who is Senior Managing Director of the Energy and Critical Minerals Practice at the McClarty Group. He is also formerly the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources under the Biden administration, also formerly the United States Ambassador to Greece and Ukraine. So someone who knows these issues extremely well. Ambassador Pyatt, welcome to the Hindustan Times podcast. I was just wondering if you could walk us through what we've really seen over the last couple of weeks and months. We've seen Indian companies cut purchases quite dramatically from Russia after purchasing a great deal from Russian companies over the last couple of weeks. We're also now seeing these major new purchases for LPG contracts from the United States. What is the picture at this point in time?
So, Shashank, great to be with you. The first thing I would emphasize is that all of us have a huge stake in getting the US-India strategic relationship back on track, including the current disagreements on trade issues. And I do believe that energy is going to be key to unlocking that. The other point I would emphasize to begin with is, remember, until the price cap was put into place in exactly 3 years ago, in December of 2022, India was a marginal purchaser of Russian fossil fuels. It was a small part of India's overall energy mix. Then the amount ballooned, partially by the design that the Biden administration put into place. Signals changed under Trump, and it really feels like things are getting back on a better track today, which we should all welcome.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about sort of how we got here, right? Because you were one of the key officials. You were, as I said in my introduction, the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, and you were extremely closely involved. I remember sitting in on a briefing with you perhaps in 2023 when you were in government about the design of these oil price cap schemes. And the concern from a lot of Indians then, which I'm sure has been articulated to you, is that part of the design of the price cap schemes, which we then saw US officials come to India and articulate, was that as long as India purchased under the price cap, it was all right for India to purchase Russian energy. That, of course, came at a major discount. India purchased a great deal. And then the Trump administration comes in and decides that it wants to take a very different approach and decides almost on a dime that India is going to be a problem child when it comes to its energy policy, then imposes a 25% tariff. Could you speak a little bit about the uncertainty of this policy? I mean, you folks in the Biden administration had a particular view. The Trump administration, for the first 6 months of the administration, had a particular view and then changed. And somehow India became a problem when it came to getting Russia to the table and purchasing Russian energy. Could you talk about that? Because it seems for a lot of Indians that the policy has changed radically and often not without too much explanation.
I think you've described it exactly right, Shashank. And I take the point that there has been a loss of trust in some parts of the Indian strategic community because of how these issues have been handled. One of the characteristics of the Trump administration, of course, is that policy direction can change on a dime, can change very quickly, and oftentimes not with a lot of explanation. But it is what it is. And I think the good news in that regard is that now you see clear signals from the Indian government in terms of their determination not to litigate the past, but to disengage from Russian energy. I would cite as particularly important the announcement last week by Reliance that they have ceased all Russian energy imports, and that by the 1st of December, there's going to be nothing left in the Reliance pipeline. So that's an important development. Equally important is the announcement that you alluded to at the beginning, which Minister Puri made last week regarding India's decision for the first time to sign a long-term contract on LPG offtake and a volume of imports from the United States equal to 10% of India's annual requirements for a commodity that touches, as I know from 7 years living in Delhi, touches almost every Indian household. So it's really, really important that we're going back to thinking about these issues as a driver of collaboration, as a means of balancing and reinforcing our trade relationship. I think there's even more that can be done in the future. I think looking at the investments that Indian companies like Gas India Limited can make into LNG production here in the United States. And obviously, the LNG sector is a hugely important one for the Trump administration in particular. There will be additional opportunities for India over the short term as you see huge increases in the volume of energy coming onto the global market from companies like Venture Global on our Gulf Coast that has huge expansion coming online. So the market is going to become much deeper. The price will become more competitive. We recognize that India is going to look first and foremost to its neighbors in the Gulf as a supplier because of the price advantage that that provides. But we also need to recognize the benefits that come to the bilateral relationship, a critically important bilateral relationship for both countries that comes from deepening our energy commerce. And hopefully, last week's announcement from Minister Puri are just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. You talked about benefits to the bilateral relationship. One of the key ideas that was floating around about, the announcement of this deal to buy LPG was getting the trade deal done. But I'll just get to that in a second. The question I really wanted to ask was, do you see a bit of a design here in terms of the fact that we've seen the United States, of course, now sign this major energy agreement with India. We're hearing talks about a deal on LNG as well. At the same time, the United States policy has also ensured that Russia is increasingly going to be sidelined and that Indian companies are going to be purchasing less and less from Russia. So, American supply is on the up, Russian supply is on the decline. Was this part of a design for the United States, which is that it wants to position itself much more as a reliable supply for India, even if that means pushing the Russian supply option out of the market?
Well, let me go back again to my point about 2022. It was only when the price cap came in place that India became such a major buyer of Russian energy. India did so at the time with the strong support of the Biden administration, including officials like myself, but very senior officials as well. The Deputy Secretary of Treasury has spoken about this issue. That policy changed because of our elections, and elections in both of our countries have consequences. But I think the important point which you reinforced is that now we can look at energy as a driver of cooperation in a context where the United States continues to grow very strongly. We're producing more than 13.5 million barrels a day of crude oil, more than the United States has ever done before in history, more than any country has ever done before in history. And at the same time, you're seeing massive growth in LNG volumes. LNG liquefaction capacity in the United States will double before 2030. So you're going to see a much more liquid market. And in that context, I think Indian policymakers, like Minister Puri, who I think has played an honest and important role in trying to drive this issue back on the cooperative track that we all want, Indian policymakers can say, okay, let's meet the Trump administration in their own terms on the issues that are important to them. I would
Right.
also add one other important point, and that relates to sanctions recently imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft, but also clear signals coming from the Congress, from Senator Graham and others, that the United States, that our Congress is determined to move ahead on even more sweeping secondary sanctions on Russian energy as part of our effort to hold Putin account for the invasion of Ukraine and to incentivize him to begin to engage seriously in diplomacy.
Right. Ambassador, I'm going to ask you one final question to address. Let me see the jitters that have come up in New Delhi that you acknowledge about how the United States has dealt with this issue, which is that once the United States sanctions were announced on Lukoil and Rosneft, you saw this 8% increase in global Brent crude oil prices. That was projected by some to perhaps impact India's annual oil import expenditure by around $6 to $7 billion. So India was spending $6 to $7 billion more on the purchase of energy, which of course India is never happy to do. Also, at the same time, there was this question of the United States using its financial leverage to push India away from what it considers a strong strategic partner, which is Russia. And of course, that happened at a time when the India-US relationship was already a little fragile because of what had happened during Operation Sindoor. And as you said, and as you acknowledged rightly, that the policy has changed on a dime. It isn't exactly clear. Could you speak to that concern on the Indian side that for some people, that certainly has been a conversation here in Delhi, that the United States has used its financial power to essentially push the Russians out, increase their own exports, and also in the process, by pushing the Russians out, have jacked up the price of oil. And that is, of course, going to impact India's import bill. So all in all, this is the complaint that a lot of people have made about the Trump administration, which is that, of course, it looks out for its interests, not so much for the interests of India and other partners and allies around the world. Could you address that concern? And then we can move on to another couple of questions that I had.
So, two quick points. First of all, over 3 decades plus of working on this bilateral relationship, the one principle that's always held true is that both governments act in their interests. That's the reality for two large global players who have a clear strategic vision. I will also say, on your question about pricing, markets go up, markets go down. One of the things that's most striking to me about the sanctions announced on Rosneft and Lukoil is that, in fact, they have not disturbed global markets very substantially. And we also have to bear in mind that Indian companies like Reliance made huge windfall profits off of 3 years of the price cap policy because there were massive volumes of cheap Russian crude that refineries like Jamnagar were able to import, which were processed into other liquids, diesel, avjet, petrol, which are sold into global markets with a global price. So India has done just fine out of this disruption caused by Russia's weaponization of its energy resources. And I think as we look to the future, India will be a beneficiary from America's energy abundance. It will create beneficial impacts for India because crude oil prices are much lower than they have been, because LNG prices are coming down, and because America's energy, because it's not controlled by a government but by private companies, is uniquely supportive of India's vision as a major energy importer to be energy secure and not be subject to the whims of one strategic agenda or another.
Right. So let's talk about some of the benefits that you were talking about that comes with a closer energy partnership between India and the United States. Some of the talk that we were hearing was about the fact that the announcement of this LPG deal was also timed to get the trade deal through. India, one of the major commitments that India made was to rack up purchases of American energy. It's already done that on the crude oil sector. We've talked about this LPG deal, conversations about an LNG deal as well. So the focus is, or the idea is, that these energy purchases will put President Trump in a decent mood, and that will help the India-US trade deal go through. Of course, the only thing is that we still haven't seen that trade deal get done yet, and we've been hearing since January that it's almost there. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? How does this new energy announcement impact conversation about that trade deal? Also, that 25% tariff that President Trump indicated that he was in a mood to remove because India is now cutting purchases of Russian energy.
So all of this is to be welcomed. as is the Reliance announcement of last week, which I want to underline the strategic importance of that. But one thing I will say, Shashank, from my platform here at McClarty Associates, where I work with a lot of global companies, every company that I work with only will welcome the normalization of the US India trade relationship, getting through the jitters that you talked about that were a product of the Trump administration's Liberation Day tariffs and everything that followed on from that. We have a huge interest in each other's success. And as I continue to emphasize, you cannot have a China plus one strategy if you're a major American manufacturing company unless you have a presence in India. So I give a lot of credit to the negotiators who are working through these difficult issues. Far be it from me to try to predict when exactly the breakthrough is going to be made. You can see how senior visits have been an important part of these conversations, whether the Japanese agreement, the Korea agreement, and then the willingness of those governments also to emphasize and to underline the role that Japanese or Korean or European companies are playing here in the United States. And in fact, there's a narrative that India has in that area. I think there's not a month that goes by that I don't learn of another Indian global company that I had not been paying attention to previously, which is expanding its footprint, its manufacturing and services footprint here in the United States. And that's what we should want to see, a growing and balanced trade and services and goods relationship, and our companies benefiting from each other's comparative advantages. And I think as we get through this very rocky period of US India trade relations, I hope that leaders in both countries will remain focused on the long term strategic logic which lay behind the US India civil nuclear deal and which lays behind now 3 decades of investment by Republican and Democratic administrations in the United States in building out that strategic relationship.
Right. Ambassador, if I could just ask you another question, just looking forward, you talked about the importance of the US-India energy relationship. I just wanted to ask you a question. Some of the conversation that has happened about Russian energy and India's relationship to Russian energy is also pointing out that, look, the sanctions that the United States have placed on Rosneft and Lukoil, it impacts around half of Russian energy production. That's true. But there's the remaining 50.8% of, let's say, unsanctioned Russian crude that remains accessible. And of course, some forms of Russian crude oil exports really allow India and Indian refineries to produce the kind of diversified petroleum exports that India has gotten used to, that India is competitive in making. So the idea is that there's still value in the Russian energy relationship. India is going to continue to pursue that with unsanctioned oil. But I ask you, how exactly is the United States going to look at something like that? What is Washington's view on India's long-term energy relationship with Russia? Because the entire conversation that we've seen is that India has said publicly at several points that, look, our energy security is important to us. As you said, countries will always follow their interests. And it seems that India is determined to maintain Russia's role in its energy mix. How exactly is Washington going to look at that? Is this going to be a persistent point of tension going forward?
So obviously, Shashank, I can't speak for the Trump administration, but I think you see in Congress, especially with the Graham bill on secondary sanctions, a strong determination to hold Vladimir Putin to account for what he has done to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. I don't think that's going to change. And so I think as we look to the future, as an advocate of the US-India strategic relationship, what I want to see is an India-Russia energy relationship that looks a lot like what it looked like in 2021 before this whole episode began. And at that moment, then, I think you're confronting a Russia-India relationship, which is largely based on nostalgia. Because if you look at the key issues that are going to shape India's future competitiveness, that are going to determine the success or failure of India's goal of being a fully developed economy by the time of the centennial of its independence in 2047, that's going to hinge on the quality of the relationship and the collaboration with America and with American companies on issues like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, life sciences, agriculture, next generation agriculture, how our agricultural economies adopt to the reality of a changing climate and the challenges that that creates for farmers, whether in India or in the United States. How our companies collaborate to de-risk our dependence on China. I was very glad to see over this weekend more announcements about India's collaboration with US allies like Japan, Australia, Canada on critical minerals, an issue that was a priority for my tenure in government, and where I remain convinced that there's much more that India and the United States could be doing together. So that's really the vocabulary of the future. I think the vocabulary of the Russia-India relationship is the vocabulary of the past. And while there will continue to be certain areas of advantage, in no way do I see that as either a point of competition with the United States, because we're in different leagues. This is just a totally different US-India relationship today. And my great regret is that the Trump administration, through its first 300 days, did significant damage to that strategic relationship. But I think you see from Ambassador Gore and others, including the recent comments from President Trump that you referred to, a recognition that that's not in our interests either, and that we all have a stake in the normalization and renewed growth of that partnership.
Understood. Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, thank you so much for joining us on the Hindustan Times podcast, breaking down for us the moves that we've seen, especially in the energy geopolitics of the relationship between India, Russia, and the United States. Major announcements coming in terms of the India-US energy relationship, and also perhaps for something that we might see in terms of the future of India's energy relationship with Russia. Thank you so much again, Ambassador Pyatt.
Great to be with you, Shashank.